Just another heads up, I'll be gone again this Friday for basketball, so.
Great.
Just wanted to
Let me know.
And I know the policy.
Great. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. I hope that you had a great MLK weekend and enjoyed the extra time off. So we're getting back here into the second week of the term and starting to settle in a little bit more. This week, we're going to be focusing on group norms and group membership. So when you're a part of a group, you might take on different roles. There might be unwritten rules and behaviors that you do as a part of that group. So we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of that and starting to understand more of the dynamics of group membership, behavior, and participation. So if we think back to last week, we took some time to discuss some of the different paradigms of small group communication. So in other words, these are ways of thinking about how small group communication works, whether it's a rhetorical approach, examining the role of persuasion, or it's an approach that's thinking about members of a group like cogs in a machine. I also introduced the small group reflection assignment to put that on your radar so that you're prepared to complete that assignment by a week from Sunday. So just for your review, these 5 different paradigms are ways of thinking about small group communication. You might consider using one of these paradigms as you're working on the reflection assignment, since they help us to understand how small groups behave. And then the small group reflection, again, that is coming up here. And I encourage you, we'll be spending some time today to discuss this assignment and help you to brainstorm it. But I do encourage you to start to think about this one, start to think about a group that you might choose to analyze for this assignment. And I encourage you by the end of this week to have locked in a small group that you're choosing for your analysis. That way, if you're running into issues or need any additional help after this week, you can reach out to me and I can help you to figure out a group that might be a good candidate. That way, you can focus next week on drafting and putting this together. Again, this is a pretty small assignment. It's just 2 pages, so it can go higher if you want to. As a reminder, I'm asking you to think about how this small group communicates, including the ways that it has norms, behaviors, and so on. We'll be talking today about Belbin's self-perception inventory, which is 9 different roles that we take on as a member of a group that help us to understand some of the different things that we might choose to take on. And then lastly, to assess some of the strengths and weaknesses of your small group's communication. And again, the rubric here is available as you're working on this assignment so that you know what to expect in terms of how it'll be graded. I will look at rough drafts or outlines if you send them to me in advance. I just ask as a cutoff that you send them to me no later than a week from Friday so that I can turn that around in time. Any questions about small group reflection, anything we talked about last class, or anything in general related to the class at this point? If questions do come up at any point, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we'll move full steam ahead into the new stuff for today about group norms and membership. So we'll be talking a little bit about group norms and the ways that group norms are important when we're thinking about this reflection assignment and the ways that we become involved in groups through the use of norms over time, and also be talking about the self-perception inventory, the 9 different roles, and giving you the opportunity to think about the roles that you find yourself most likely gravitating toward. So if you've taken a class with me before, you know how this works. If not, now that we are in the 2nd week of the term, I'm starting to take attendance for this course. And the way that I take attendance is pretty straightforward. I will, on class days, have either an individual prompt or some type of group prompt. And what I ask that you do is include your name on either a sheet of paper that you'll pass forward at the end of class, or if you're using a device, you can also type it and email it to me by the end of class too, either just in the subject of the email or as a separate attachment. Either way, this attendance prompt for today is going to have 3 different parts that we're going to work through as we go through the different things in today's class. The first part that I'm asking you to do is a little bit of brainstorming. So I want you to think about some small groups that you're either currently a part of or you have previously been a part of. And ideally, this is between 3 to 8 people. If it's just 2 people, you and one other person, it's just interpersonal communication. I don't think you're going to be able to look at the team dynamics in the same way. And if it's much more than 8, it generally gets a lot more chaotic at that point and harder to assess. So I encourage that 3 to 8 sweet spot. One easy option is if you're involved in extracurriculars or activities on campus, maybe it's athletic groups, maybe it is some type of team or group that you find yourself really interested in. That is a really good starting point, or one that you've been involved in the past, perhaps at a high school or previous university or EOU. Another thing to think about are clubs or groups that you've been a part of. So maybe you're really into the agripreneur club, or maybe you're really into FFA chapter, right? Depending on the group you're a part of, you might think about this as an option as well. You might think about community activities. Maybe you're involved in a community that does some like trail management, or maybe you are in a volunteer firefighter group, or maybe you find yourself in a D&D group or a Magic the Gathering group or club. You can think about some of those communities that you're a part of, and also think about social groups such as friend groups, as well as dorm mates, roommates, people you might occupy physical space with on a regular basis. So I want you to take some time to think about ideas here of possible small groups that you could choose to analyze for this assignment. And once you've developed a good list of some possibilities, I would like you to put a star next to one that you feel like might be the best candidate for this assignment. That doesn't lock you to it, and you can definitely change which group you choose to focus on later, but this gives you a good starting point to think about how you might explore this assignment. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this, and then we'll talk a little bit more together after that. So take a couple more minutes here. As you're thinking about among your ideas, what might be the best candidate, a good tiebreaker is to think about a small group that you have the most detail to describe. So for instance, maybe this is a group you're currently a member of, and you know that they have another meeting that's going to be between now and when the assignment is due. You could take that time to really try to observe that small group and what that group is doing in its upcoming meeting. Or maybe it's a group that you've been a part of, but you still are in contact with some members of the group. Or maybe you have some type of recording of a meeting or gathering in that group too. That's another option that lets you easily refer back to that group. Or maybe it's a group you're no longer a member of, but you really have a lot of memories and a lot of history of that group. The more that you can draw from to describe the details about that group's communication, the better.
Did you say that like work colleagues with those kind of small groups?
Yeah, especially if like there's an activity or task that you've been doing with them together. Yeah. So yeah, work colleagues is a good example of a small group that you could look at as well. So go ahead and finish up your current list and hang on to it. You're welcome if you come up with more ideas over the course of the class, to just jot those down. As we keep talking and looking at norms and behavior, might be some more ideas that come up. If you're drawing a bit of a blank and having some difficulty narrowing it down, let me know by the end of the week, and I can help you out with some brainstorming as well. So this gets us in terms of thinking about group norms, right? And group norms are particularly important when we find ourselves members of small groups, because for many of us, we might be entirely new to a group, and we find that the process of adjusting, of cognitively figuring out what's going on in the group, of feeling included and feeling like a member, of doing the right thing, of being respected by other people is very significantly impacted by group norms. And being able to communicate effectively in a group means understanding the role that norms play, the way that norms help groups become more efficient, and the ways that group norms allow us to understand the backgrounds and styles of groups as well. I like the classic example from Avengers, right, where Captain America goes to Wakanda to see Black Panther, and he goes to bow, right, and Black Panther kind of stops him, right, and puts his hand up and says, hey, no, we don't do that, right? We don't bow. You're kind of treated as equals. The hierarchy that comes in bowing to somebody that would be seen as a king is not the type of role or power relationship that he wants. And so that's kind of a famous scene in helping us to think about what norms are and how norms shape the behavior and communication of groups. In this case, the use of nonverbal signals to convey something like respect or appreciation. So group norms, right, refer to rules or guidelines. So they can be written and hard-coded. This is what a group should do, X, Y, Z, or they can be things that we should or shouldn't do, right? We should be respectful without explicitly identifying what that means. They reflect expectations, right? So when we're in a group, we have expectations about how members of that group are going to behave. For some of you, you might be part of an extracurricular or athletic group in which you can't use EOU logo in an inappropriate way, like in photos that might not be official, right? So there's some expectations surrounding how you might present yourself. And it's also about how members of a group should act and interact. That is, independently, what should a group member do? So for instance, if you're part of a team or group, you're representing EOU, and maybe when you go to a competition or you're traveling, then there's an expectation that you shouldn't talk negatively about other people while you're there. When I was involved in speech debate, you probably had something similar if you're involved in a club that travels. We had a policy called ban talk. And the policy of ban talk is that you're competing against other people, but you can't speak negatively about them until you get back in the van and you're back with your own team. Then you can just spill the tea, say whatever you want, but if you're in the bathroom and you're saying, oh, I hate this competitor, blah, 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 find out that they're like in the stall next to you, doesn't go so well. So how we should act is important, and also how we should interact. When we're a part of a group, perhaps we avoid ad hominems, we avoid name calling and personal attacks on other people, right? We do what we can to rein that in and to behave in a way that's meeting those expectations. We can think about norms as different than things like values, which refer to the things that members of the group see as important, such as valuing kindness. Beliefs, which refer to sincerely held perspectives like religious or spiritual views, right? And rules tend to fall under the hard-coded and more explicit end. So group norms are incredibly important to groups being able to work together. As we said at the beginning of the class, groups work when they are more than the sum of their parts, right? When they're able to act, to accomplish tasks, to put heads together, to do things in a way that people just would not be able to do when they're on their own. Think about something like a TV show or a movie, right? Even like a news show. It's wild to me how they are able to come up with so much material in such a short time, right? That requires some intensive teamwork, because you have to have people who are managing the lighting, the cameras, who are writing the script, who are doing the jokes, who are doing the little cards, the graphics and photography, who are figuring out the advertisers, the commercial break, and all of those different things, right? There are so many parts that have to come together to make the group work effectively. And good communication is crucial to that. If you've ever taken interpersonal communication, you might be familiar with the model or the transactional model of communication, which suggests that there's a lot of different parts of our communication. There's a sender who's delivering the message. There is a receiver who's taking it in. But what we know is that that is never one-to-one, right? There's the role of noise, that's the interference that impacts the ability of the message to get from point A to point B. Sometimes that is physical, like we hear the sound of a jackhammer or lawnmower outside, and that impacts our ability to hear the message. We are in an afternoon slump, we're feeling a little bit tired, maybe we're a little less focused at that moment, right? So in those situations, we find ourselves needing to use group norms as a way of helping group members reduce that noise and understand each other better. We might think about culture as well. For example, in some countries like Bulgaria, shaking your head means yes and nodding means no. So there's ambiguity in our use of nonverbal communication or our use of subtext, cultural differences, and so forth. So group norms are crucial to make sure we're all on the same page, right? So group norms help us communicate. They also help us to create boundaries. Black Panther says, hang on, we don't do that here, right? Asks us to stand back up. So they kind of in this case are trying to eliminate what might otherwise be a difference in power, right? And power roles among members of a group. And group norms can help us to effectively understand what relationship we should have through power distance. So for instance, if you're talking to a supervisor or boss, how openly do you speak to them? That's the role of power distance. If you have lower power distance, you're more likely to openly disagree. Higher power distance means that you generally defer to authority a bit more and perhaps don't speak out of turn. And ambiguity and uncertainty is important. This is something we experience when we're a part of a group. So maybe you're a new member of a team and you're worried that you don't fit in or that people don't like you. Somebody who's a more senior member might say something like, it's great to have you here. We're really happy you're a part of the team, and might use those types of assurances to resolve the uncertainty that we experience in a group, right? We allow group norms to regulate our communication. Otherwise, right, we fester anxiety, uncertainty, and distrust among people who we're working with. You're ever playing like a game like Among Us or similar kind of type of game where you have to work together in a group and there's somebody that you're not supposed to trust or you don't fully trust? It's an example here of the importance of group norms and building those norms in those settings. So we can think about this as a quadrant, right? In terms of norms either being explicit or implicit, or these norms being focused on the individual or the whole group. So explicit means that it is very clear, it is written, it's enumerated, it's something that is very specifically stated to other people. At an individual level, perhaps that means that you've had to sign a contract or a waiver as being a part of a club, or maybe you're in a class that's going on a field trip, right? And you have to sign a permission slip or form to go on that field trip. So that's an explicit norm that everybody receives. An explicit whole group norm would be something like a group being asked to have minutes, right? And keep track of minutes and write minutes down for each of their meetings. Or members of the group not being permitted to use the EOU logo in a way outside of professional competition. Implicit, what's not hard-coded, right? Might be that generally in your meeting, you're asked to raise your hand to speak. You might notice as you're getting a feel for a first meeting that people generally don't talk over each other. They raise their hand to speak, they get added to a list. They use a stacking system whereby people get slotted to speak at certain times. So you notice that, and as a result of that, you choose to raise your hand too. Not because it's something that's written and that you have to do, but because you've noticed that that's what people do here. And then an implicit whole group norm Good example is somebody who brings in donuts to a meeting, right? Or maybe you're part of a team where when your team does well and you win a competition, your coach takes you out for dinner. That would be an example here of a whole group implicit norm. Not written, but it's something that you come to expect as a part of the group. So we can look at these norms as they relate to 4 different categories. We'll be talking a little bit more about each of these and asking you to think about some of these too. The first are interaction norms. A good example is going back to COVID-19. It's never fully gone away, but when we had, really high cases and we had pretty significant lockdown, there was a focus on regulating our interaction with each other. One good example is 6 feet, right, of social distancing. That's the use of proxemics, of nonverbal communication, to signal the physical distance between you and somebody else. That's an example of an interaction norm. Or maybe your group meeting shifted to Zoom or Google Meets, or you use something like Slack or Discord to communicate. So how people communicate within a group, that's the role of interactions. Secondarily, we have procedure norms, right? So if a norm is procedure oriented, it's how the group is functioning. How are they able to work together? Good example of this is maybe you've got a calendar and maybe you've been invited to participate in a meeting. You've got a time and a place, you've got a slot, you've got an invitation, right? You are in the group and the group functions by meeting every Thursday at 3 p.m. for practice. So procedure-oriented norm explains that a group functions by meeting at this date at this time to accomplish this task. So that's how they kind of work together. Third of all, we have status norms, right? So a good example of this is ASEOU, right? Associated Students. It has, right, a role of student leadership and governing. There's a president, right, who takes on a student leadership role. There are students who take on a variety of positions at ASEOU, such as treasurer. And this organization, right, is designed to have these different roles and status that members of the group have as well. So status norms deal with the influence that group members have, especially related to each other. What does it mean to have a leadership role in a group as you're participating in the group? What does it mean to communicate with people who have that leadership role as well? What are the expectations of being something like a captain? And then finally, we have achievement norms. These are related to both the nature and amount of work in your group, right? So achievement norms, you can think back to performing, right? The final stage that happens before a group comes apart. What is it that your group is hoping to do at the end of it? Maybe your group is studying, right? You have a study hall, study circle for a physics exam, and your group works together to prepare, to practice. And your goal by the end of the study meeting is to fully have studied and prepared for the chapter 4 quiz. So that would be an example of using achievement norms about what it is that your group accomplishes at the end of it all. So what I'd like you to do as part 2 of 3 is to return to that attendance activity. I want you to pick one of the groups. Maybe it's the group that you're interested in for this assignment. And I'd like you to think about which of your group norms might be explicit versus implicit, right? What are things that you and your group have to do that are hard-coded versus things that are norms that have developed? And you might start to think about the categories of group norms too: interaction, procedure, status, and achievement. So I'll give you some time to work through this as well. couple more minutes. Go ahead and wrap up. So as you're thinking about groups that you might be analyzing, right, you might start to think about and pick apart the norms and things that you find that the group members do. For people that have been a part of a group for a while, there's a good chance that norms are things that you just come to accept about the group. Like you all high five right before you go in for a game, or you all have a ritual that you do before you start, your D&D campaign. Like they're just things that you just do without really thinking about it a whole lot. Or perhaps you might notice that there are shared norms and things that are in common across different groups. So you might notice that moving from a club or activity in high school to college, that you found some crossover in what it is that groups might be doing or practicing, despite some differences in members and demographics. So what I want to do next is to talk about Belbin's self-perception inventory. And I've got a video clip that I think does a good job of providing some examples and assessing some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different 9 roles. And we'll also be talking a little bit about these 9 roles. So each of these has its strengths and weaknesses. And as you are paying attention to the video and the discussion about these, be thinking about which of these roles you find yourself gravitating toward the most. So tag yourself, which most speak to you, your interests, and what you find yourself doing as you participate in groups in the world.
At these roles in a bit more depth. Let's start with the social roles. The first role is the resource investigator. This is somebody who uses their inquisitive nature in order to find ideas to bring back to the whole team to be developed further. Their strengths include being outgoing and confident, as well as being enthusiastic when it comes to getting the work done. These people are not shy about exploring the available opportunities, and they are happy to develop contacts. However, the resource investigator may be too optimistic about the possible overall outcomes of the task. They are also likely to lose interest in the task once the initial enthusiasm has passed by. Belbin said not to be surprised if a resource investigator forgets to follow up on a lead. We then have the team worker. This is the team member who really wants everybody to work together to get things done. They help the team to connect smoothly and use their own versatility in order to identify what needs to be done and, if need be, to complete it on behalf of the team. They are cooperative and work well with others, and are generally good at diverting any arguments or friction between the team. Teamwork is in the sense of good listeners, and they tend to be receptive and fair. Their allowable weaknesses are that they can often be indecisive when it comes to quick and important decisions. They tend to avoid confrontation, and you shouldn't be surprised if they avoid making a decision that might be unpopular. This is often to avoid upsetting the cable cart, so to speak. Another important role is the coordinator. This member of the team is important when it comes to working out what everyone can and needs to do, as well as encouraging team members to connect. They're good at focusing on the team's overall objective. Coordinators are great at delegating. However, this can sometimes be seen as one of their allowable weaknesses. They may offload their own work to others. Over-delegating would leave them with little to do, and for this reason, other team members can see coordinators as being a bit manipulative at times, but they do have lots of strengths. Coordinators are confident and mature and good at identifying talent within the team. They are also good at clarifying goals and staying focused on these goals. We then have Belbin's thinking roles. The first of the thinking roles is the plant. This is the problem solver. Someone who is creative and thinks outside of the box when it comes to fixing mistakes and sorting things out. Often labeled as unconventional, plants are creative and imaginative free thinkers who are good at and keen on generating ideas as well as solving problems that others maybe cannot. However, plants of course have their allowable weaknesses too. They are often thinking at speed in their own head, which hinders their ability to communicate effectively with other members of the team. Plants may ignore incidentals, and Belbin says we shouldn't be surprised to find that they can be forgetful or absent-minded. We then have the monitor evaluator. This is definitely one of the thinking roles within Belbin's team roles. Someone who provides a very logical eye and is able to make impartial judgments when this is called for. They're able to step away from the task and look at things objectively. A monitor evaluator's strengths include being strategic and discerning, as well as being unemotional and able to make accurate judgments. However, these people can lack drive when it comes to getting things done or inspiring others, and they can be seen as being overly critical. Monitor evaluators can also be fairly slow when it comes to making decisions, which can hinder progress. We also have the specialist, the third and final thinking role. These people are dedicated to their task because they have in-depth or expert knowledge of a key area. Specialists are able to provide knowledge and skills that other team members don't necessarily have. They are self-starting and also dedicated when it comes to doing what they need to do. Specialists are single-minded, as in they focus on one thing. This leads to one of their allowable weaknesses, however. They contribute on a narrow front and might not get involved elsewhere. They're known to dwell on technicalities too. Belbin says not to be surprised if the specialists overload you with information, which can be tricky. And the last category of Belbin's team roles is the action or task roles. The first in this category is the shaper. This is someone who really keeps things moving. The shaper provides a necessary drive, which means the team doesn't lose focus. They're happy to challenge and to be challenged. Shapers are dynamic and thrive on pressure. They also have the courage needed to overcome obstacles and complete the task at hand. The shaper isn't without their weaknesses either. They are or can be prone to provocation, which can lead to people's feelings getting hurt. Due to having so much drive themselves, they can become aggressive or bad-humored just by wanting to get things done. And what about the implementer? This is someone who plans to put together a strategy that works and allows things to get done. They are also the one that ensures this plan is carried out. An implementer's strengths include being efficient and reliable, as well as being very practical. They know what to do when it comes to turning ideas into action and how to organize the work that needs to get done. Their weaknesses include being slow to respond when new possibilities are offered or suggested, meaning that they can be a bit inflexible. Belbin says we shouldn't be surprised if they are reluctant to give up on their own ideas and plans in favor of positive alternatives. And then we have the completer, or the finisher. This is the ninth and the last of Belbin's team roles. The completer finisher is someone who is often called in towards the end of the task in order to check what has been achieved so far. They will scrutinize the work and make sure it meets the highest possible standard. Completer finishers are very conscientious, bordering on anxious, when it comes to the work. They're diligent and observant, meaning they pick up errors to be fixed. However, This means that they often worry for no reason and can be very reluctant to delegate work for fear of it going wrong. Often completed finishers are accused of taking their perfectionism to extremes. So Robin's team roles are really useful in our
So I think this does a good job of highlighting and giving us some examples here of these different roles. And I want to go over a few more details about how people in these roles might choose to communicate. So as mentioned, these roles can be divided in terms of the things that people do. So are you focused more on the thinking and invention process? Are you focused more on completing the task? Or are you focused more on managing human relationships, delegating, and dealing with the resources that you have available? So one way of thinking about the plant is to think about like a vine or plant that can grow in a lot of different directions, right? That is looking for sunlight. You might notice that sometimes they have weeds that can grow like in the tiniest little bit of dirt that shows up in the middle of concrete, right? In this way, the plant is able to dynamically grow, it changes, it moves around, it adapts to different circumstances, right? If you're out in the woods and you see trees that have grown at really interesting and weird angles, that's a way of thinking about the plant too. These are folks who are really able to address and think outside of the box on problems that come up. Other people are hitting a blank. The plant is really able to come forward with some ideas. And as mentioned, they're really good at developing these new ideas, but not necessarily as much at getting them in practice in a practical way, and might struggle a little bit with figuring out how to get outside of their own heads and share the ideas. So resource investigators, as mentioned, are people who are able to create opportunities. A good example here is of your advisor, right? If you have an academic advisor, they're generally people that are letting you know about scholarships, opportunities, deadlines, and generally people who are trying to provide you with resources that will help you to succeed, right? So somebody who's able to create and build bridges is oftentimes really useful in this role. A co-coordinator, right, is somebody who's delegating. It's somebody who's helping with decision-making, figuring out who's going to do what task. Really good at helping to establish a sense of order in the group, right? But what you do not want is to be somebody who just delegates and then doesn't do anything yourself, right? You do this, you do this, you do this. Well, what are you going to do? Oh, well, I'm going to, kick back on the beach with Maya, right? That would be a bad example of a delegate. Shaper, right, as mentioned, is somebody who's really focused on addressing particular problems or challenges that have come. Maybe you have a relative who has some trouble getting internet set up, or maybe there's a particular task that they need you to do, like, maybe they're trying to get a refrigerator inside the house, right? A shaper is somebody who's able to really deal with that big issue, but as mentioned, sometimes they can be a little bit inflexible. Monitor evaluator. So if you have ever played a game that involves strategy in any capacity, like maybe a team-based board game, or some type of team coordinating game, a lot of like MOBA type games like League of Legends, right? There's a lot of examples here of people who are tasked with developing strategy, right? Who are trying to figure out and make calls and decisions on what people should do. There's a new Fire Emblem game coming out in a couple days, and I'm excited to be in that role for that. So somebody who takes on a strategic role, like in a strategic or tactical style of game, is somebody who is taking on that responsibility. Team worker, right? So a lot of people might find themselves in that role where you're part of the group, you're contributing, you're taking on tasks, and contributing to the overall well-being and goals of the group. But you're generally not somebody who likes to rock the boat or push the group to rethink things, right? It can be great at accomplishing tasks, but at worst, it can be lemmings off a cliff. An implementer is taking ideas, putting them into practice. We brainstormed, okay, cool. What are we going to do? A completer finisher, right? As mentioned, this is somebody who wraps things up. A good example of this, if you've been involved in something like journalism or a school newspaper, is to think about an editor, right? At the end of the day, articles are coming together. The editor is the person who is making those final changes and tweaks, who is rewriting, who's fixing it up and getting it to a presentable state. So an editor is generally a completer finisher who's wrapping it up, putting a neat bow on it. Specialist. So one good example here of a specialist is somebody who is delegating, who has delegated a specific task. So maybe you might think back last week, we had somebody from IT who came in to fix the projector issue. That's a specialist who brings in a unique set of skills. Sometimes there are guests to the group. So somebody who's coming in to resolve a specific issue, such as a tech issue, to help the group out. So what I want you to do for the third and final part of your attendance is to think about these different roles and to think about, of these, which you find yourself in the most when you're in small groups. And it could be more than one, but of these 9, which do you find yourself gravitating to more than others? So I'll give you some time to think about that for the final part of your attendance. So take another minute or two to finish up here. So I'm curious, of the parts of this inventory, how many people included plants Many people included resource investigator, co-coordinator, shaper, monitor evaluator, team worker, implementer, completer finisher, and specialist. So a lot of variation, kind of similar to my last class. Most people chose team worker, and I think that's interesting. I think in a case where you're a student who's part of clubs or groups, especially if you're in your first year or two here at EOU, you might find that you're in more of a team role where you're kind of following along, you're taking on the responsibilities that you're given. And one thing to think about is that these roles are not set in stone. In fact, there's some pretty substantial variation in the team roles that happen over time. As you might find yourself to be more senior in a team or group and working with younger folks, you might move from being more of a team worker to more of a co-coordinator, right? Or a completer finisher, depending upon the experience that you bring to the table or the circumstances that might require you to take on more of a leadership role for the group too. So this is not to say that any of these roles are hard-coded. They can change over time and they can change depending upon the responsibilities that the group members need filled. So to wrap up for today, we took some time to talk about group norms, including Belden's self-perception inventory. We also understood how some of these roles can explain how we participate in groups the way that we do. On Friday, we'll be doing a fun activity where I'll be asking you to figure out what to do when you're surviving on after a plane crash. So we'll be doing that as a group activity for Friday. Please pass forward or email your prompt for today. If you haven't done so already, make sure your name is on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you again for Friday's class.